Okay, so this is a lecture for lesson 11. The book likes to call it atomic pudding, and so what we're really looking at are the different models of the atom. And so prior to this lesson, you worked on a project where you were researching the different scientists involved with the atomic theory. We call that the atomic theory timeline project, okay? So the atomic theory basically is an idea that all matter is made up of atoms. It's a super old idea, dates back all the way to the ancient Greeks. Over time, scientists and philosophers have come up with various models for the atom based on their observations of the world around them. Those models help scientists picture or visually come up with ways that they can explain the behavior of matter. Different scientists alter and revise models as new evidence comes about. Scientists are now in agreement that the atom consists of a central nucleus with electrons surrounding the nucleus. So we're going to look at how that model has changed or evolved all the way up to this current understanding. And something to always remember when we have changes and things like that, or how we say that the model has been revised, think of when you have to write a paper for English class and you do some peer editing, or your teacher, does some revisions and things like that with you. You're changing what you originally started out with. I'd be willing to bet that you've never just written a perfect paper right off the bat, because we're all learning and we're becoming better. Okay. Also, you could think of it, or think of this process as like looking at cell phones. I like to talk about looking at cell phones because a long, long time ago, cell phones started out as a bag that you plugged into your car. And now we have cell phones that we can't live without and provide us with tons of access to information. Okay, we have a bunch of learning goals in this lesson. I know it seems really wordy, but you're going to be able to describe the historical development of the current atomic model. Where did it start and where are we now? Okay, you're going to be able to describe and draw an atomic model, and explain what structures go where in that atom. You're going to be able to describe the dynamic nature of the scientific model, so we're looking at how they've changed. You'll be able to distinguish between an atom and a molecule. You'll also be able to explain the purpose of a model and the uses of it in science. And then you're also going to be able to, again, draw some simple atomic models. Okay, so the drawing that you see here is a model of a super tiny cube of gold. Okay, so this is a model. Well, what do you think a scientific model actually is? Okay, a lot of times students will say, I think it's a smaller version of what I'm studying. But in this case, since we're looking at a tiny cube of gold, and if you notice the size or the height of this sample, we see tons and tons of little yellow or gold spheres, and we are at a very microscopic height. So this model is allowing us to see the different pieces and parts that make up this gold, or how small these items actually are. So we're taking something that's really, really small, and making it large enough for us to see. Okay. 2 says the spheres in this model represent atoms. What do you think atoms are? A lot of times students say that atoms make up everything, which is 100% true, and that's really one of the big key parts of this lesson. Okay. How could you draw a model of the element copper to show that it is different from the element of gold? Well, we know that from what we've learned within section 2, we've learned that every element is different. Okay, so different elements have different properties. If they're in the same column, they'll have similar properties, but no 2 elements in the periodic table are exactly the same. So we would have to look and see, the size of the atoms of copper, okay? Or how maybe they're lining up. If you take a look at how the gold atoms here do show up, okay? So we're going to look at some key terms here. Super important to make sure you mark these down because you're going to use these interchangeably for the next 13, 15 lessons, other than model. But everything else you will be using a lot. So let's get these down pat. The first one is a model. So you'll notice here I've given you the textbook definitions, and most of the time I've written down something to help you remember it, or I will verbally give you some information. So a model is a simplified representation of a real object or process that facilitates understanding or explanation of that object or process. Okay. We can also call this, it is something that makes something that's very, very small or way too large easy for us to study. Scientists make models so that we can study from them. Okay. We can learn things by looking at models. Okay. Atomic theory. It's a theory that states that all matter is made up of individual particles called atoms. This atomic theory also gives us information about protons, neutrons, electrons, and the nucleus, which are also terms that you'll learn here in a second. An electron. This is an elementary particle with a negative charge that is located outside of the nucleus of an atom. It has a mass of about 1,838 atomic mass units. The mass of an electron is super, super, super small, okay? Electrons we can't see with our naked eye. They're so tiny, okay? Nucleus. The nucleus is the dense, positively charged structure composed of protons and neutrons that is found in the center of an atom. The nucleus, you've learned about the nucleus with a cell in terms of biology class, or with your, 7th or 8th grade science class. And we know the nucleus is where all of the energy and all the power and all the functions go on within a cell, really. So the nucleus here within atoms are very important as well. An atom, it's the smallest unit of an element that retains the chemical properties of that element. It can also exist as a separate particle on its own, okay? So something to remember, an element is only made of atoms of that element. For example, think of that picture that you saw in the beginning of this presentation. Gold is only made of atoms of gold. If we were to make a model of copper, copper is only made of atoms of copper, okay? If we have more than one type of atom together, then we would have something that we could call a molecule, okay? Because we are combining more than one type of element, okay? So each element is made of its own specific atoms, but if we have more than one type of atom, then we obviously have more than one type of element together, which gives us molecules, okay? So molecules have those chemical combinations, different chemical combinations for different elements. Okay, a proton. Protons are positively charged. They are located in the nucleus of an atom. Okay, protons and neutrons have relatively the same mass. They're pretty much about the same size. Okay, protons are positively charged. Okay, a neutron. It's another particle that's found in the nucleus of an atom. It does not have an electric charge. Okay, no electric boogaloo here, no electric charge. Again, the mass of a neutron is about the same of that as a proton, which is again 1 AMU. Notice if you think back to what you wrote down for the mass of an electron, there's a big difference between 1 atomic mass unit and 0.1838 atomic mass units, okay? Big difference in the decimals there. Okay, So we're going to look at these pictures. We also have another one, which is called the electron cloud model. But these 5 are what we're really going to focus a lot of our time on. So we have the solid sphere model, the plum pudding model, the nuclear model, the solar system model, and the proton model. So something you want to do, make sure you mark these down in your notes. You can take screenshots of these. I've also clipped an image of this to this lesson video, so you could just copy and paste that and stick it into your notes. So you have these images so you don't have to draw them out or find them somewhere else. But these images are very important for you, okay? All right, first one, solid sphere model. I see part of my slide is cut off here. So the solid sphere model, you'll see the picture right here in the top right. This was done by John Dalton in 1803. He studied the chemical combinations of elements. So he observed that elements combine in whole number ratios. So that means if you think back to when we looked at, I have NaNCl combining together to give me NaCl. Well, I have 1 sodium and 1 chlorine in that chemical combination, so my ratio is 1 to 1. So we can think back to the last section about those. John Dalton reasoned that the elements are made of tiny, indivisible, spherical particles called atoms, okay? His model, so again, if you look at that picture, he said that the atom is a solid sphere that cannot be divided up into smaller particles or pieces. Cannot be divided up into smaller particles or pieces. So he said the atom can't be split. Okay. The next one, we have the plum pudding model. Okay. We have the plum pudding model. This was by J.J. Thomson, not J.T. Thompson. This was done in 1897. He was a British scientist. He zapped atoms with electricity. He observed that negatively charged particles were removed. J.J. then he reasoned that atoms contain negatively charged particles, which he called electrons. Okay, so if you look at the picture, they refer to this as plum pudding because that was something that was big back in 1897 in Britain. A lot of people think of this as rice pudding, or some people will talk about this in terms of it being like a chocolate chip cookie. But a chocolate chip cookie doesn't move around a lot. If you have ever had a parent, grandparent, maybe yourself, have made Jell-O and you put a can of fruit cocktail in there, think of it maybe like that. This model says that the atom can be divided into a fluid, which was the pudding, okay, or we can think of it as Jell-O, and the electrons, okay? And the electrons are like the chunks or the pieces floating around in there. Most of the atom is made of the fluid. It spreads out and is positively charged, okay? Electrons are tiny, and they're negatively charged. So when you are looking at this model up here, all of this good stuff where you see this gray shading is considered the nucleus for him. Okay? They're trying to say that this all here is a nucleus. Now, we don't really know that word just yet, but they said that we have this fluid that is positively charged, okay? This fluid is positively charged, and these little spheres in here are the electrons, and they are negatively charged, okay? So we have positives and negatives, okay? The nuclear model, here is another one. This was Ernest Rutherford in 1911. You'll notice I have this going from furthest away to the most recent. Ernest Rutherford, he was from New Zealand. He shot tiny positively charged particles, which he referred to as alpha particles, at thin gold foil. You would have seen that in the video when you did your atomic theory timeline research. He observed that most of the particles went through the foil, but some of the particles bounced back. Okay, so he's shooting positively charged particles. So what do you know? We know that opposites attract and likes repel. So if some bounced back, then that means there has to be something that's positively charged inside of that foil as well. Okay, now, is it made completely of positive charges? No. There have to be spaces of something else if some of those particles are going through, okay? So he reasoned that there must be something small, massive, and positively charged in an atom. This is what he referred to as the nucleus, okay? If you look at his model up here on the top right, the model can show us that the atom is divided into a nucleus, which is that dark gray sphere here, and the electrons, which are these nice little dots. You see two of them on here. The nucleus occupies a small amount of space in the center of the atom. The nucleus is dense and positively charged. The electrons circle around the nucleus. The electrons are tiny and negatively charged. Most of the atom is made up of empty space. We'll take a look. You have that nucleus right there in the center, and the electrons are kind of out there on those little rings. So it does appear to be a lot of empty space. Next, we have the solar system model. This is by Niels Bohr in 1913. He studied the atom and explained that light was given off when elements are exposed to a flame or an electric field. This is something that we'll see in lesson 17 when we get into flame tests. We get to try these out. So he observed that only certain colors of light are given off with each different element. So he is a Danish scientist. Don't think he's making donuts or anything or pastries. So for example, he said that hydrogen atoms give off red, blue, green, and blue light. He reasoned that the electrons orbit around the nucleus at different distances, like planets orbiting the sun. The electrons in these orbits have different energies. When an electron falls from an outer to an inner orbit, the color of light changes, and then that's based on where those electrons are orbiting. Okay. The model you see here on the top right, very kind of more similar to what you'll see as the simple atomic model, but you'll notice some differences. The atom can be divided into a nucleus and the electrons. The nucleus is in the center of an atom. Then that nucleus is massive and positively charged. The electrons circle around in orbits around the nucleus. Those electrons are tiny and negatively charged. Different electrons are in different orbits at different distances from the nucleus. Okay, proton model. Ernest Rutherford again. So he made a comeback 7 years later. He realized that he could use his alpha particles as bullets to knock positively charged particles around. So he then said, I'm going to call these positively charged particles protons. So he first saw those in his gold foil experiment, and then he decided he could use this to his advantage. He reasoned that the nucleus must be a collection of protons, okay? So he said that the nucleus contains protons. They're tiny and positively charged. Those electrons are tiny and negatively charged. Most of the atom is empty space, okay? The electron cloud model, this is one. I had to pull an image because I didn't have a really good one for you. Two different scientists come into play here with the electron cloud model. We have Werner Heisenberg. He's a German scientist. He also brings us other things such as the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. He proposed that there's a cloud model of the atom. He suggested that the location of an electron is unable to be specified precisely. So he's saying that the electrons are floating around in this cloud of space and they're not held on a really, really specific path. Okay, so they can be in different places at different times. James Chadwick, a few years later, said that the nucleus contains uncharged particles, which he referred to as neutrons. And he said that the neutrons are really important in holding the protons together. So the neutrons, which have no charge, hold those protons into place in the nucleus. Okay, so the model that they've given us, collectively, says that the electron cloud surrounds the nucleus. The cloud is made up of fast-moving electrons, and that nucleus is made up of protons and neutrons. Okay, what you see here, this is called the simple atomic model. This simple atomic model shows us that we have protons and neutrons inside of that nucleus. You'll see them represented with different colors here. And then on the outside, you will see electrons. Okay, you will see electrons, and we have those rotating on different orbits outside of the model. Okay, and those electrons, again, those are negatively charged. So something to remember is that a neutral atom has the same number of protons or positive charges and electrons, which are negative charges. So my overall number of positives and negatives equal out to be 0, okay? So let's think about some different things. What do we mean when we say that the nucleus is dense? If we say the nucleus is dense, that means we have a bunch of things. In this case, we have a bunch of particles, and we call these subatomic particles because they're smaller than the atom itself. We have a bunch of these little particles, and they are packed in really, really close to each other, okay? We talked about density in the beginning of the year, and I said, well, there's going to be a really big difference if we pretend that the classroom itself is the amount of space we have, and the students in there are the particles. They don't have to be really packed close together. If we go down the hallway to the handicap stall in the restroom and we take that same amount of students and have to put them in that same stall, we're going to be more dense in that tiny space compared to the density we would have if we were just inside of that larger classroom, okay? If you have 6 protons, which are positive, and you have 6 neutrons, which are neutral, what would the overall charge be on the nucleus? Okay, we have 6 positives and 6 neutrals. We have nothing to balance out those positives, so our overall charge would be positive 6, right? Positive however many we have, okay? What if we have an atom that has 4 protons, 4 neutrons, and 4 electrons? Well, we have 4 positives, 4 neutrals, and 4 negatives. So let's focus on the positives and negatives. 4 positives, 4 negatives. My overall charge would be what? What would be 0, right? All right, so let's look at some key points here going along with this atomic theory. Okay, contemporary scientists are in agreement that matter is made up of tiny particles called atoms. Okay, so let me explain some things here. They're also in agreement about the basic structure of an atom. They know that there is a tiny dense nucleus in the center of the atom. While it occupies a tiny space within the atom, the nucleus accounts for over 99% of the mass of the atom. The nucleus contains positively charged particles called protons and neutrally charged particles called neutrons. Negatively charged electrons are located around the nucleus. The mass of an electron is about 1/1800th the mass of a proton. Although the electrons are very small, they move around the tiny nucleus in a relatively large space outside of the nucleus. Therefore, we can say that an atom consists pretty much of just some empty space. Okay, let's look at this second key point here. Okay, a neutral atom has no net overall charge. Okay, has no net charge. That means the total number of positives, or the total number of protons, and the total number of negatives, or the total number of electrons, add up to give me 0. Okay? Key point number 4 here. Scientists have created models to describe atoms. So models are usually simplified imitations of something that you want to explain, or we need to understand, or we need to study. So some examples: a model airplane is a small representation of a large aircraft, okay? A model can be a plan, it can be a physical structure, It can be a drawing. It can be a mathematical equation. It could be a mental image. Chemists create models to explain how matter is constructed and how it behaves. Different models aren't right or wrong. They just tell us different things. They all give us information. Okay. Key point number 4. Scientific evidence is a collection of observations that everyone agrees on. We have a continual process of gathering new knowledge to improve our understanding of the world. Okay. When we have a model and it's supported by a ton of scientific evidence, it is usually accepted by the scientific community. As new evidence is gathered, scientific models are refined and changed. This is what science is all about, a continual process of gathering new knowledge to improve our understanding of the world. The models of the atom you have studied in this lesson are useful to our thinking about the atoms and elements and how things have changed, okay? As we go further on in this unit, we're going to learn more evidence that has brought us to, further revisions of the atomic model. Okay, here's a model of a carbon atom. Okay, if you look for carbon on your periodic table, carbon is atomic number 6. Okay, it is in row 2 or period 2, and we can say it is in group 4A or 14. Okay. So now that we have that information, it has atomic number 6, okay? We want to list 2 things that this model itself tell us about the carbon atom. So don't go and Google search something. I want you to say, okay, I know that there are 2 things this model can tell me. Well, what do we know about models, okay? Or models of the atom. And this is an example of a simple atomic model. So 2 things this model can tell me, and there are actually more than 2. I know that I have a nucleus, okay? That's one thing you could say. You could say the nucleus in the center has protons. That's something else you could say. You could say that the nucleus in the center contains neutrons as well. That's another point. You could also say that the electrons move around in orbits around the nucleus. Okay. Something to think about as well. What is something that this model doesn't really tell us about the carbon atom itself? Okay. And so far, really, we've talked about the locations of these particles. Something that looking at this model can't tell us is anything about the actual sizes of things. There's no scale on this model. If you look at a map, they'll have like a little scale drawn somewhere on there, and that can help you identify the distances between things or how large or how small things are. These models don't give us any information about the actual or relative sizes of these particles or how far apart these circles are that these electrons are floating around on. Okay, so you have to use your brain here. You have to take this information, process it, and move along with it. Okay, so I want you to understand all matter is made of atoms, and those atoms contain protons, neutrons, and electrons.